Hi BookTube, welcome to another fiction review. Today we're going to look at a book that was written by a BookTube creator, and she's someone who's been producing content for 7 years. I found her channel, I think, very shortly after I discovered the wonder that is BookTube. And she's become a familiar face to me, such that since I am trying to push myself now to introduce some horror into my reading, I think it helps, and it would help my natural cowardliness if the author themselves were less of an anonymity. Today we are reviewing Managing and Other Lies by Willow Heath, published in 2024, July 2024, so this book's nearly a year old, 184 pages, and you can see I've put the UK and US Kindle and print prices. I purchased this on my Kindle app and read it that way. Genre, Willow acknowledges Shirley Jackson and Kafka as influences on the stories in this collection. She likes to break away from just having prose in paragraphs, narratives that we are all very familiar with. And she's using a lot of narrative forms that let her tell stories with dialogue alone, which she can do because the encounters between characters are usually one-to-one. They're intimate connections. And much of the horror is derived from the kind of threat that happens when one person places trust in another person, and then that trust is subtly or suddenly betrayed. Willow Heath is going to be a very familiar name to a lot of people who've been around BookTube longer than me. Her channel, Willow Talks Books, everybody's familiar with it. I believe it used to be called Books and Bow, which linked into her website. Willow was a former high school English teacher. She also spent several years teaching abroad in high schools and universities in China, Japan, and Korea before she turned all that experience round and focused it on a new career as a BookTube creator, editor, critic, and author. And you can see her website there. My description box will be full of links, not just to her website, but to her video announcing the publication of Managing. Lots of stuff in there, so please have a look. Willow's writing has also appeared in New Scientist, in Imagine Games Network, and Culture Trip. She also narrated the audiobook version of the LGBTQ plus book and history by DK. You'll find a link to that as well. There's again, lots of links. Also links to the Amazon UK page for the book. So yeah, please go in there. I'm trying to encourage impulse buying if you can't already tell. There are 6 stories in Managing. Story number 1 takes up about 47% of the book, or in Kindle pages, that's 84 pages. The remaining stories are all about the same length, so between 20 and 30 Kindle pages each. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of the stories. Story number 1, Managing. This is where the setting really has that Kafka-esque, surreal anonymity. You are in a house on the edge of a village. The village has no name. Some people in the village don't know anything about the existence of the house. And the house itself is full of anomalies. And the narrator who arrives there to take up a job as a house sitter, a housekeeper. In fact, the narrator themselves are not 100% sure exactly what their job is meant to be, and there doesn't seem to be any end point that's known to that employment. But at any rate, they decide to try and to live with these bizarre circumstances and to work through them. So where their first-person viewpoint goes, so then does the reader. This story sucked me in right away because, like the narrator, I was constantly asking questions that didn't always get answers. I'm not saying that was unsatisfying, but the act of asking questions became enriching in itself because it made you ask questions about gender identity, which is a running theme throughout all the stories in Managing. Story 2 is Chloe.Claire 1. Now, this is a story told in a dialogue of YouTube comments between a creator and their fan. And as soon as I began reading the comments of the fan, I became edgy. Do you know the kind of person? Everybody must have someone like this in their life, but perhaps not as edgy as this particular fan. Someone who's so nice, so complimentary, so sweet in everything they say that you know immediately that you are not dealing with the real person, who, therefore, is the real person. That's how that story goes. Story 3, A Mother's Love is written as a one-act, 6-scene play, and there are inserted annotations by this unnamed director who's obviously watched the performance and has some ideas for changes that must be made and implemented for the next performance. And that's weird because the action in the play would be unrepeatable if it were something happening with real people. That is, if you were the protagonist in this story, this scene that happened to you would happen once and not be repeated again. And I thought that was interesting because you're left with that sense that this little drama that you do watch or read about, rather, will get replayed inside many different homes between many different parents and children, sadly. Story 4, We Understand Each Other Perfectly, is written in ordinary prose narrative, and it's about a hitchhiker pickup, so that's always a good scenario for a horror story. And there was a point in this story where I expected a certain repeating meme to reoccur, something that had happened in stories 1 and 3, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. The horror in the story is a surprise, really caught me off guard, wasn't expecting it. It's well hidden and comes very close to the end, very satisfying. I'm still trying to decide whether this story or Managing is my personal favorite. Story 5, titled Baby, this is a pure dialogue story, so no narrative at all, not even he said, she said, and it's between the separated parents of a baby. And it creates a very pacey story because there's just, person saying something, person replying, person saying something, person replying. And that consistently rapid pace just felt to me, it was a little bit too much out of sync with the real-time events. Of course, real-time and story time are always two different things, but this was so pacey ahead of the events themselves and the building dread that I found myself wanting a pause, wanting something to kind of just slow the story pace a little bit so that dread could really build, because I didn't end this story feeling that as much horror as I felt I should, given what I was actually being told on the page. And the final story, Little Blue Sticky Notes, I did love this one too. It was paragraph prose, and it was one of those creepy stories where the cause of evil is never seen. And so it makes it difficult to know whether you've defeated it or escaped it. I like that. It was very haunting. The largest number of characters appearing in any given story is 3. And I say that even though story number 3, A Mother's Love, on stage, there should be 4 actors in scene 6. However, one of those actors is not visible to all the other characters on stage, if that makes sense. And this is the repeated meme that I found really satisfying. It appeared in several of Willow's stories, and I liked it very much. It's a male whose existence is somewhat paranormal in one way or another. Either he can appear or disappear very quickly, unusually, or he can be seen by some characters but not by others, or he's not visible, but he's clearly present and he's clearly active and affecting things. This was a fantastic thing. It made me, I had a personal reaction, which I'm going to share. It may or may not have been Willow's intention when she wrote, but these males struck me as human-shaped symbols of patriarchy, which, as you know, is not my favorite term, because it sometimes makes it seem as though the abuses of patriarchy are only committed by men, and that I don't believe that's always true. But for the sake of broader understanding, okay, right here, I'm going to use it. The male figures seemed like walking, talking metaphors for this ugly patriarchy. And certainly they couldn't be treated as real people because they don't always do the things real people do, but they had influence. And where they appeared in Willow's stories, it seemed that the point was being made that patriarchy, those toxic ideas about what is a man and what is a woman, were having or trying to have an influence on the characters. In A Mother's Love, I liked how the male was not visible to one of the characters in the story, suggesting that sometimes we may be an agent of patriarchy without realizing, without seeing what we are doing. Or in the case of another story, the male character isn't ever visible, but they have this ability to create circumstances that disturb the narrator. And it suggested to me how difficult it can be to get away from the influence of patriarchy, even when you are fully aware of it and trying to get away. The majority of protagonists in these stories are trans women, and the horror for these characters rests on issues of trust and safety. You know, who can you trust to accept you? Who can you trust to protect you. And it's the same concern that cis women have. And that's what makes the story We Understand Each Other Perfectly such a beautiful illustration of the sad irony that some cis women have been unable to accept and believe that trans women can be allies in the aims of feminism, and instead seem to believe that there are just additional sources of danger. Interwoven with that, and this seems especially true in the first story, Managing, is the question of to what degree is it good to conform to female gender stereotypes, in order to affirm a female identity. Now, there's a female entity in the story Managing. And again, this is my opinion, and I don't know if this is what Willow intended, but this female entity has a very dangerous appetite. And I could not help but be reminded of Margaret Atwood's first novel, The Edible Woman, and also Susie Orbach's book, Fat is a Feminist Issue, which deal with this fact that the feminine is what? I wondered if the female entity was a symbol for those less than healthy expectations put upon women to reduce their size, to have less of a physical as well as a social presence. I don't know. It's an expectation that can become an obsession with some women, and this female entity certainly seemed obsessed. But to talk about the content overall, I will take a point from another BookTube creator, Isaac, Cheesecake Guy, and he reviewed this book about 7 months ago. And he remarked that the stories were more atmospheric than they were viscerally frightening. And I did agree with that. I thought that was a good point. Willow talks about getting her inspiration, of course, from Shirley Jackson and Kafka, two authors that I think I've read one short story by Shirley Jackson, and that's it. So I've not read Kafka, but I know enough about the author from hearsay to know that his story scenarios are their realities all their own. They're not fantasy worlds in the traditional genre fantasy sense. But the first story, Managing, at times convinced me that the setting was almost dreamlike, hallucinatory, or inspired by maybe a guided meditation about the conflicts and questions created by someone who was thinking about rethinking perhaps their gender identity. Regarding problematic content, there is a lot of body horror in this book, right? That is, bodies mutilated in some way, and you have to witness that process and witness the pain. So, I'm never crazy about that myself. But in these stories, for some reason, and I think it was because they were making a point, or I felt they were making a point, and therefore it seemed to me that the body horror was more metaphorical than real, and that helped me to cope with it. As a rabbit hole, I was trying to think of something interesting to say about independently published fiction, more than just, complaining about the publishing industry and their crazy gatekeeping. It pains me to consider the possibility that with the current global delusion that seems to think that far-right politics will provide us with something different than they've provided in history, but if the current political pressure being brought to bear on LGBTQ plus communities continues, if it reaches a point where mainstream publishers get cold feet when a novel looks promising otherwise, but it's written by a queer author or it has queer characters, then independent publishing might play an even bigger role in giving a voice to LGBTQ plus authors. And if you watch Willow's video, she'll admit that she chose self-publishing because she knew the work presented too many hurdles for a commercial publisher. Unknown author, short fiction collection, because for some reason those don't sell. I don't know why. And then she's dealing with themes of gender identity and gender transition. In one way or another, commercial publishing does have to play it safe. It's a business run by shareholders. We know how that works. It has to pick products that are going to sell quickly and sell abundantly. But I'm really glad that the technology exists now that makes self-publishing so easy. I know there is a lot of argument that self-published fiction, that because there isn't the gatekeeping expertise out there, you're going to get a lot of poor quality stuff. Okay, yes, that's true. But the advantage of a lot of self-published fiction is that you can meet the author either on YouTube or through a blog or a podcast. Some kind of self-publishing platform allow for dialogue back and forth to hear someone express themselves on camera, read what they have to say. It's a good indication of how well they structure their thoughts and choose their language. And so that can be a really strong indication that anything that they write is going to be worth reading. And that's another review done. Please check out the description box, everybody. It's loaded. It's got a lot of good stuff in there. Obviously, I want you desperately to go and buy Willow's book. We all have to support each other, don't we? In one way or another. Also, I feel a catch-up video is overdue from me. Maybe I'll do that thing where I combine a little news with a short tag. I bought some books again. Yeah, if you watch my video where I talked about the fun that I've had in times past with Jack Kerouac, you'll laugh when I show you that how I've been talked into, yes, giving the guy a second chance. Anyway, until then, I hope all your reading plans are going well, they're on course, and that you're enjoying the books immensely. So, take care. Until then, everybody. Bye-bye.